welcome back to the next installment of our Founders Forum Insight series. Today we're joined by my colleague Paul O'Dea, who is the director of the Enterprise Ireland Founders Forum. Paul, you're very welcome. It's lovely to have you. You might give the guys just a little bit of background on yourself, I guess, to get kick-started. So your involvement with Founders Forum and you've 20, 30 years sales experience under your belt. So maybe just give us the 2 minutes on yourself before we get started into today's topic.
So thanks, Emer, and great to be here today. My background is primarily early stage businesses and growing them internationally, and sales has always been a key part of that. And I guess I've seen the evolution of sales from very relationship based, where it took a long building of relationships and long complex sales cycles, to much more of a digital kind of journey today. And obviously involved in Founders Forum together with Emer and Select Strategies. We partner with Enterprise Ireland on that, and we hear lots of stories and challenges from the broader HBSU group in terms of how they're addressing sales, particularly in the current COVID environment.
Okay. So just put some context around today's discussion. So we're obviously still, today is the 15th of May 2020. So we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm delighted to say here in Ireland, we've just had announced at lunchtime that the first wave of easing the restrictions is coming into play on Monday, which I'm sure we're all really looking forward to. It's been a long 9 weeks. So in the context of the COVID situation, I heard the phrase in my own founder group put very succinctly on earlier this week, which was sales has come to a screeching halt. So I guess we might kickstart, Paul, with what are you seeing for, I guess, both the companies that you're involved with as facilitator on the forum, but indeed more broadly. So what are you seeing in terms of sales for early stage companies over the last couple of months in light of the situation we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, I guess it breaks down into three parts. I think if you look at the macro environment, there's definitely, we're living through one of the biggest crises, if you like, in hundreds of years. And even though we're living with it day to day and we're part of the news story and we're listening to the news every day, there's some fundamental shifts going on that are affecting early stage and more mature businesses now and in the future. And if we just take some very simple trends that are really almost racing certainties now, because in the context of so much uncertainty, you have to kind of look at, well, what is certain? And I guess the first certainty is that the whole working from home, we've gone from a world where most of the workforce worked and went into offices or factories. And now coming out the other side of this, there's no question there'll be a lot more working from home. And that's almost a given. It's interesting hearing anecdotal stories from startups that found themselves on Zoom calls and ended up in the living room of Fortune 500 companies. And as one of the startups said to me, he couldn't get through the front door before Christmas. And now he was in one of the C-levels living room and making comments about pictures on the back. So, yeah, we've this kind of shift, but the shift to home working is definitely going to be with us for a long time. And I guess what's also happened is that there's a huge trend that's, because we came from a collegiate working environment where everyone was together, people could get stuff done at the water cooler or in various discussions, whereas now, because of the need for social distancing and the need for remote working, the whole automation agenda is right back front and center. And I think particularly when we look at technology and obviously the virtual worlds that many of us are operating in, but the whole technology infrastructure is going to go through a massive uplift when we come through the other side of this and budgets can be there, because the inefficiencies of being remote from each other are starting to show cracks. So I think that would be number two, that there's a huge big automation in IT and e-commerce and all of the rest, and that's a racing certainty. And I think the third that's very clear is that startups have always been resilient. And anybody that gets into a startup knows that it's going to test them And indeed, many have been really tested over the past number of weeks. But I think there's a spectrum here. There's a spectrum of startups that have almost thrown their hands up in the air and assume that sales are going to come to a screeching halt. And then there are probably others that are looking at their businesses in a tougher, resilient way and are starting to shift the business model a little, and also taking real concrete action on sales, which hopefully we can chat about a little bit later.
Okay. And just for companies, I guess, that are a bit further ahead of our Founders Forum companies, what are you seeing in terms of the client base we have in Select Strategies, who might be a little bit further on than the guys? What trends are you seeing in terms of sales? Like, I'm assuming, they've got, cash burn, bigger teams, the kind of the show has to go on. What are you seeing in terms of them? Have sales come to a screeching halt, or is the show still on the road?
Yeah, and again, it varies. For companies that are exposed to many sectors, if we just took the automotive sector, for example, or tourism sectors, there's no question that some sectors have been really, really badly hit, and the timeline to recovery is incredibly unpredictable. But if we go just a little bit more mainstream and look at the broader technology landscape, and indeed food landscape, the first thing in the more mature companies is that pipelines have unquestionably stalled. There's no, obviously in some cases there are deals happening, but often they were deals that were really, they were well underway, and it's just closure and paperwork and all of the rest. But pipelines are stalled. I think the second part that has become really, really clear to the more mature companies, and many of the startup companies are the best exponents of this, is that the trend towards digital buying, and that trend, which has been going on for a period of time, the whole use of, at its most basic level, websites, product demonstrations, video conference calls, digital buying has accelerated really, really fast. And many more mature organizations have to adapt to this, because many of their salespeople spent a lot of time in airports and planes, and a lot of face-to-face contact, which is incredibly important. But I think the buyers now are driving this, and the buyers are very much saying, look, actually, when we want to buy even relatively complex B2B, we want simple things. Just show us that you can solve a big problem for us. Make it easy for us to collaborate internally and make some decisions. And show us how you can collaborate and create value for us and with us on the buying journey. And a lot of these fundamentals in the more mature organizations, they're looking at digital and going, well, gosh, there are digital ways we can do this. And maybe there are digital ways we can do it that won't necessarily be as good as face-to-face in some instances, but maybe in other instances, they'll be better. And the buyers on the other side are welcoming this transition. So we're already seeing a huge transition towards digital buying and the use of digital tools like video conferencing, collaboration tools by the buyers. But I suspect over the next 2 to 3 years that's really, really going to accelerate, so that face-to-face buying will actually reduce yet again over the next period.
Okay. So it's kind of sounds like you're saying there's opportunity in here as well. It's not all, oh, well, it's all negative and we'll just have to wait till we can get back in front of the customer. It's kind of like, well, maybe there's opportunity in here to do things differently that might actually benefit the companies in a sales context.
Yeah, I think, it's hard to talk cross-sectionally and say there's opportunities everywhere, but certainly there are clear opportunities on the shift, and they probably break down into something like the following. Firstly is refining the proposition. So the proposition before COVID may have, companies may have had product market fit. Now in a different world, the proposition needs to be refined. Maybe it needs to focus a little bit more on efficiency rather than scale, or whatever it is, but the proposition needs to be refined. And then when you look at the opportunities, going back to the company I mentioned who are in the living room of the Fortune 500, the access to really key stakeholders is much more readily available now than it would have been when they were protected by legions of armies that you couldn't get at them.
Yeah.
So access to stakeholders, and also wonderfully innovative things like in many companies, there's, if you like, front of house people who will just broadly think of as sales and customer service. And then there are, if you like, background people often who have extremely good knowledge and extremely good intellect around the particular problem their company is solving. And one of the parts that has created a huge opportunity for both parts of the company to work together is the use of very simple Zoom calls. So if we take technology companies, we had many instances in the HPSU group of CTOs who probably never darkened the door and never wanted to darken the door of a customer premises in their lives, or it would have given them, made them feel fairly ill. And now they're suddenly on Zoom calls and they're the heroes. They're cast as the hero. And they're talking with CTOs on the other side. And they're now becoming a key and integral part of the proposition. So the ability to bring the back office or CTO or biotech expert onto these calls for 10 or 15 minutes can make a huge difference. So rather than being siloed teams, the idea of one team together facing the customer both strengthens the HPSU's perspective, but it also strengthens the buying and collaboration interaction. And I guess then the third part that there's definitely opportunities in is the whole social selling environment when it's done carefully. We're kind of seeing in HPSU's a spectrum of some who are, almost on a tools fest quest, that they're trying every tool, they're trying it for a few days, then trying something else and all of the rest. And that is probably a relatively futile task unless it's done in a disciplined way. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing HPSUs have really thought it through and are combining tools like Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and they're using the social conversations and social listening conversations to actually create a presence for themselves to help generate leads at the beginning of the
okay.
So there's
and you're talking about something a little bit more than just, the marketing team publishes a LinkedIn post. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about more, I guess, a personal, if you like, presence that reflects on the company to help with that. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, very much so, Emer. And it's often founder driven. So if we just take a very simple example of one of our clients, they've engaged very heavily in LinkedIn groups where there are many buyers from their sector engaging. But every contribution by the founder is really telling, and it's really adding value to the group. And now that founder's in that group, based on the knowledge and the discussion, he's taking that knowledge and repackaging it into a YouTube channel. And now the YouTube channel has become something that the group respect because they're hearing value and they're hearing real things. Now, to try and create that interaction might have required attending a conference, doing a whole set of other things, whereas now suddenly founders particularly, as you say, it's not just a marketing department initiative, are engaging them with their community in a really purposeful and value creative way online, yeah.
So it's kind of like I'm replacing the time I would have spent at the conference with engaging with those people, but just through a different medium. Okay.
Exactly, and the discussions are quite meaningful and free. And then that means that the front end of the funnel is becoming populated with a set of discussions, but they're not sales discussions so much, they're business level discussions, because that was what the narrative and the communication had been on LinkedIn or indeed
sure.
on
yeah.
YouTube, whatever.
And Paul, if you just stick with the top end of the funnel, so one of the pushbacks I heard earlier this week from an early stage founder was, well, like, there's no point. Like, I'm just going to focus my attention on stuff other than sales until, let's say, Q3 or Q4 of 2020. And when I can get back in front of customers, everything will be fine. And the concern obviously is, well, we may not be able to get back in front of customers by Q4 2020. But coming back to his point, which was there's no point in me trying to generate leads or trying to fill that top part of the funnel right now. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and it's obviously sectoral dependent. And it's also, if you just take for any business and any startup, you're assuming at this stage that there's clear visibility on cash runways, there's clear visibility on time. I'd be very concerned with any startup that was, if you like, and it's probably a little bit controversial, but putting their head in the sand here and hoping that things will get better. Like, hope is not a strategy here. And engagement with the customers and engagement with prospects is going to hone and clarify what the service offering or the product offering is going to be. So the head in the sand and I'll come out with a better mousetrap when all this is over and the world will be a path to my door. I think that's a land, very futile and dangerous path. Whereas balancing time and balancing the discussions, balancing the discussions with prospects and reaching out. Remember that many of the prospects that you're reaching out to, they're sitting in their houses. They probably have more time. And as long as you're having a sensible business conversation with them, you may get a lot more attention than you would have previously. So I would be absolutely and strongly encouraging the engagement with customers. And we just take very practical examples, and they're simplistic and anecdotal. But particularly in Ireland, we obviously have the great national institution, which is the pub, and obviously lots of pubs are going to close as a result of this. But we see, pubs changing their business models now, whereas because we can't go into the pub, they've home delivery of pints. Now, how you deliver a pint of Guinness in some kind of state, in a car, and do all of that stuff within the appropriate kilometers and don't break any rules, I'm not really sure. But the point being, engage with the customer. Don't sit in the pub trying to pull the perfect pint. Figure out where your customers are, and then figure out a path to actually to servicing them and understanding their needs.
Okay. So if you go then, I suppose, to the kind of practical place for a second, and go to ideas on remote selling, and obviously we've touched on a couple of things, social selling, engaging with the customers, and having, I guess what I'm taking away from this conversation is conversations. We need to be getting into conversations with the customers, which may be different to the way we might have sold to them in other terms. But just any thoughts on ideas or tactics around remote selling? Because obviously you mentioned at the start of this, your own journey, having watched sales go through a transition from very heavily relationship based through to getting increasingly more digital influence in the cycle as time has gone on. But that relationship piece for lots of our HPSU companies is still very important. But now I can't get in front of the customer. So any thoughts or ideas on things like building relationships with customers and doing that in a virtual context, because I have no other way to do it?
Yeah, I suppose some of the principles that have always been there are the foundations. So what we've been doing with some of our clients, who are a little bit further on, is really looking at the journey from the company to the buyer. And what are the set of steps along the way? And what is the buyer thinking along the way? How are they researching? So where are they researching online? Who are they talking to? What type of discussion or demonstrations do they want along the way? So we're trying to map the buyer journey. And the buyer journey has shifted now because it's moved into a digital environment. But it's really trying to map that set of steps. So I think that would be the first place. The second is to really develop a very, very strong point of view. Having the courage of your convictions, not to cloud it in any gobbledygook or anything like that, but to have a really strong point of view that puts your head above the parapet.
Okay.
Because if you come out to buyers today, they've no time for unsubstantiated claims or anything like that. It's having a really strong point of view in your industry about how you can solve a big problem. and then publish or create content to articulate that. But it needs to be sharp, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be almost provocative. Remember, for most early stage businesses, you only need a very small number of customers in most instances to start getting movement and traction. Whereas if you're blending in with a message that isn't coming above the parapet. So I've certainly seen, whether it's webinar content or white paper content or other content being shared, which is quite provocative, but it's provocative with a real point of view. And that is getting a lot more traction than, if you like, a more sanitized version that might come with the marketing flavor. So I would encourage all founders to really dig deep in themselves and go back to the fundamentals. Why did you start this?
Yeah,
what was your passion initially? And to articulate that passion unencumbered, because in an environment like this, you've nothing to lose in a sense. But it's to let that blossom and let the founder passion blossom rather than it be constrained by any other walls around it or advice around it. Let the founder passion blossom. Let the founder passion blossom and connect to the real problems. And I think that provides a much better path to engagement digitally.
Okay. So Paul, we're going to wrap it up there, and that's been really helpful. I just want to, I guess, summarize a couple of takeaways for everybody from this. So I think the first thing is, the digital or nature of the sales cycle is with us, whether we like it or not. It's been developing over the last 10 or 15 years. It's jumped forward an amount, and it's not going back anytime soon. So we need to stay engaged with that. I think my other key takeaway from this is conversation. We need to keep the conversation going. The sales may not, people may not be in a buying frame of mind right this minute, but we need to keep the conversation going so that when they are in a buying frame of mind, then we're top of mind. So thank you very much for your time today. It was lovely to talk to you again.
Thanks, Emer.